Are there any of you in here who, after service on Sunday, go out to lunch with friends or family? Come on. When I was a little girl, my parents had a group of friends, probably 8 or 10 couples, who would get together quite frequently over the course of the year, 4, 5, 6 times a year. And they would rotate the houses where they met, and every once in a while they'd go out to dinner, but usually it was kind of a potluck served in the homes of one of the couples. And they would have a wonderful time. You know, drinks were plentiful, and food was plentiful, and jokes, and hot political debates, and sometimes cards, and sometimes other games. And it was a group that they so loved to be with, and they had named themselves the Good Group. So the Good Group was coming over, and I remember whenever they came to my parents' house, they would come, and we'd of course be really young and had to be in bed, or were supposed to be in bed, and I would sneak out on the landing and watch the goings-on and I knew they knew. I mean, I didn't know at the time that they knew I was there, but having become a parent in the interim, I know that they knew that I was there and allowed us to lie there and watch for a little while, and then would send us back to bed. And that group stayed together for 50 years. It was amazing. They could read each other's thoughts. They knew exactly what the others were feeling. And they shared times together of weddings and baby births and grandbaby births and funerals and all of that. And until the time when my dad died, and then 2 years later when my mom died, whoever was remaining of that group still stayed in touch. They had what biblically is table fellowship. Table fellowship. In the Gospel of John, this kind of table fellowship has a very significant meaning. It was an ancient tradition among the Jews, and it goes back as far as when Abraham entertained the strange angels who had come to him when in fact he was entertaining God. Invited them to sit down at the table. It was a significant part of Jewish life and a very significant part of early Christian life as well. Look at how many times Jesus sits down to a meal in the Gospels. He starts his ministry at a meal. He's at a wedding banquet. He is in Cana at that time. He also eats very frequently with his disciples. He goes to Levi's home, the tax collector's home. He goes to the home of Zacchaeus. He is criticized, of course, for that, for eating with tax collectors and sinners. His last evening is spent at dinner with his closest companions. And even after his resurrection, what does he do? But he meets 2 people on the road to Emmaus, and he breaks bread with them. He sits down and has a meal with them, and that's when they recognize him. Table fellowship. He returns to Jerusalem, and he enters the room where the other disciples are, and what's the first thing he asks for? Do you have any fish? He's hungry. Table fellowship. In another gospel account, he meets his disciples by the Sea of Galilee, and what is he doing for them there? But cooking a meal on the beach for them to sit down together. Table fellowship is extraordinarily critical. Table fellowship was an issue of contention in a lot of ways as well, especially in the early Christian movement, the early church, because the Christian movement was made up of both Jews and Gentiles. Well, for the Jews, sitting down at table with an uncircumcised, unconverted Gentile was a big no-no in the law of Moses. Couldn't do it. And sitting down with women at the table was also not common, not ordinary, and not traditional. The meals of table fellowship were generally those of male family members, male neighbors, males who could do something for you. So the struggle of this table fellowship is very prominent, especially as we read through the book of Acts and in many of Paul's letters to the Corinthians and the Galatians and so on. This breaking bread together, the phrase for it in Hebrew translates into sharing the salt. There was a way for people to identify themselves as a community. Part of it is in the command and the law of Moses, so that God can shape the people as a group, as a people with a singular identity, and God's chosen people in that way to share this knowledge and this intimacy with the only God. So the table fellowship became a very, very important part of this whole issue of dietary laws that Paul gets so upset with later on in the letters that we read. Because it was only circumcised males that could eat dinner together, could break bread to share the salt, pass the salt, then there was also the issue of, can we sit down with Gentiles? And that led in part to the conflict over whether or not, in order to become Christian, they had to become Jews first. In other words, they needed to be circumcised, and then they could become Christians as well. And that really was a major struggle. I don't know if we can figure out how tough that struggle was, except perhaps going back to the days in the Civil Rights Movement, when you couldn't share water fountains, and you couldn't share bathrooms, and you had to sit in different places, where you couldn't contaminate one another. And it was very prevalent in that. Well, here, in this story from Luke, we have a sample of what table fellowship is. What do we do at table? How do we share the bread? How do we talk to one another? Because at the time that Jesus lived on this earth, the Jewish people were a conquered people, and Rome had many, many different cultures within the empire and adapted to many of them. But then those cultures also adapted to what the Roman Empire had practiced as well. So with the Greeks and the Romans then, eating at a banquet together also involved an issue of status. So when Jesus is invited to dinner at the house of the Pharisee on a Sabbath day, heavy with meaning and all of those things, when he went in and healed someone who was sick, who was right outside the door. He became unclean in doing so. He goes into the room, and he is watching now remember, they were watching him very carefully to see what he would do. And he'd already violated the law. And he violated the law right outside the house of someone who could judge him for violating the law, this leader of the Pharisees. So he goes in, and what does he see? He sees all of the guests who are there, carefully choosing where they will sit at the table. Now, one of the things that was sort of heavily influenced by the Roman culture and the Greek culture was where people sit. And the other thing was that the host was not present while all of the guests were coming in. The host comes in this grand entrance after all of the guests are there and all of them have been seated. So Jesus is watching this going on. And he's seeing who is picking what seat and where they are all sitting. When there are guests at the table, you have to be careful of what your status is in how you choose your seat. We still do that today, don't we? State dinners, when the president is entertaining perhaps the president of another country, or the prime minister, or the Queen of England and her parliament, where everybody sits is very careful. And if any of you have ever dealt with a wedding, you know the issues involved in who sits where. So who gets closest to the head table? If we have Grandma over here who doesn't get along with the Joneses, and yet Grandma's an immediate relative and the Joneses are the employer of the bride, what are you going to do? How are you going to sit people? So those are issues then that they had to deal with. Status always dictated where people would sit at the table. And the Jewish leaders had adapted to that custom. I mean, they've been a subjugated people now for hundreds of years, and so they had been assimilated in some way. Both Roman and Greek tradition had very heavy influence on the table culture that was such an historically important piece of what happened in Jewish culture. So, Jesus was watching. And Jesus was seeing what happened when Luke writes, the guests chose the places of honor. They know where the host will sit. That spot is already reserved. They want to jockey into the best possible position that they can. So who are these people? Well, we don't really know who else was invited. We're not even certain why Jesus was invited. But when Jesus speaks a little bit later in this passage, we get a sense that we know who they are. They are probably friends, brothers, perhaps brothers in the faith. They're other male relatives. They are rich neighbors. And why, we can presume, were they invited? Well, they're invited because of a quid pro quo culture. If I invite you here, we can do one another a favor, and then you'll invite me somewhere else and you'll help me out. That had, because, it's human nature, really. It isn't just culture, it's kind of human nature. If I help you or do a favor for you, then I can expect you in turn will do something for me. And that's kind of what happens in this situation as well, and Jesus points that out. The guests are getting themselves seated in places of honor. The host remains out of sight. In a way, that's kind of a power trip, I think. Instead of like we do, we greet people when they come in the door. The host is out of sight. So some servant will come to him a little bit later and say, well, they're all here, and they're all seated, and it's time for you to go in. And then Jesus points out this thing, and I suspect because he says it, it actually happens. He says, I'm sorry, ma'am, but you cannot sit in the front row. You're going to have to trade places with somebody back there because you're really not as important as that other person. So we have to switch you around. Or, as Jesus proposes, don't put yourself in that place. Allow yourself to be honored by whoever is your host. The game of one-upmanship, the game of mutual back-scratching or quid pro quo, is a game that involves inviting those people you already know. These are folks like my parents' good group. These are people that the host already knows well. The host already knows who they are and how important they are and what kind of effect they have and what influence they can have and how they can help him out. He already invites only those whom he knows have some power to help him, people he knows what to expect things from and what they will say. However, just as God does in the passage from Jeremiah, where the people presume that they can dig their own cisterns, they can create their own places of water, living water, God turns this upside down. Jesus turns this upside down. And the expectations are shattered. I'll do this for you, you do that for me. The host can help those who help him. But who should the host be there for? How should he seat his guests? And where should the host himself be seated? What are the cisterns this guy is building for himself? The cracked cisterns, as we hear in Jeremiah. Jesus seems to be judging the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders, just as those who turned away from God in earlier generations. They claim to be the leaders, but they are not. They are ones who seek after influence and prestige. God would not have punished people with poverty, disease, with disabilities, if they had been right with God. At least that was the tendency to believe, and I think that still hangs around in the air today. That the people must have done something wrong if they can't get a job. There must be something wrong with them if they're sick. There must be something wrong with them if they live in poverty. If their parents or they had truly been righteous with God, they would not be poor. They would not be handicapped. Now, what Jesus is saying here is don't invite all those who can influence things. Invite those who have no influence at all. Invite the poor into your house. Feed them. And so the host is really in kind of a predicament here, isn't he? Because if he does that, how can they help him? What influence can they have for him? For heaven's sake, if the person is crippled, now the dining areas were upstairs where the animals couldn't come and join them. You know, the goats and the sheep and the lambs and so on. They couldn't climb up the stairs and join them. They were fed upstairs. Now, if you invite someone who's crippled to have dinner with you, that's a lot of work to get the person upstairs. The host has to end up serving them. If a person is poor, how can that person help the host? If a person is sick or diseased or has oozing sores, who wants to touch that person? And yet Jesus is saying, you will be repaid. What you do is mercy. What you do is table fellowship in its truest sense. It's important, I think, for us to remember that neither these Pharisees nor any of the other Jewish leadership ignored the law of Moses, and they did help the poor, and they gave alms, and they built hospitals, and they helped out people. And what they didn't do was invite them into their homes and invite them into their hearts. Jesus teaches his disciples to go out and to serve and to heal and to teach and not to take anything with them at all. What were they to expect? They were to expect hospitality. They were to expect fellowship. They were to expect others to extend themselves in service to them. Both Jewish and Gentile Christians were commanded to eat with those who were different from them at the same table. That had to be awkward. That had to be uncomfortable. And if we believe anything that Paul writes, sometimes they absolutely refuse to do that with one another. Time and again, Jesus has confronted our traditions, our assumptions about God and about faith. And even though it's unlawful to work on the Sabbath, Jesus heals. Even though it is unlawful to prepare food on the Sabbath, Jesus and his disciples pluck grain and eat it. Who was included at this dinner? And why did the host include Jesus? They were all watching him carefully. Does this mean they're going to want him to slip up? They're going to capture him in some moment of so disobeying the law of Moses that they can denounce him? Did the host want a miracle? Was he one of the leaders of the church whose daughter lay dying and he needed Jesus to heal her? We don't know. But what we do know is that Jesus is not going to be anybody's dupe. Jesus will not be somebody to be used by others. He knows exactly what's going on. We have our own guests that we invite into our lives, to our own table of our own lives. We, after all, host our own lives. So who do you regularly invite? And if Jesus came to sit at your table, would that list of invitations of people invited change? I don't know. Do the guests that you invite make you look good, give you joy, help you to be a better person? Perhaps your guests jockey for position near you. I see that with my grandkids. They want to be sitting with their mom or their dad, or they want to be sitting with grandma. They jockey for the position until they learn how to share that space. It's strange, sometimes I think, how the very things that we avoid are the very things we need to be confronted with. It's like having a muscle that you hold tight all the time, like carrying books. If he had to carry those books all the time, his muscles would be in spasm in a particular position. And then that would come to feel normal. And until he learned how to relax those muscles, he wouldn't know what normal really feels like, what health really feels like. It's difficult to let go of some of these things. And Jesus is asking the Pharisee host and those at table with him to let go. So invite those you don't want to have around, because they're right there anyway, aren't they? They're right outside our door, right beside our hearts. Open your door and look at them. You know, the poor woman sitting over there, that is your own emotional poverty, your own emptiness. The crippled man mirrors the chip on your shoulder. The lame child embodies the pain that your heart keeps as you limp through life. The blind woman back over there is your own limited vision of who you can be in the company of Jesus. The angry foreigner over there, well, you know, that's your own alienation from God that you've covered over and ignored for so long. The people at your table, you know their conversations already. They're your regular life guests. Jesus says share fellowship with the different and with those who are sometimes frightening to us. Look with their sightless eyes, limp with their life's crutches, lie on their begging mats, smell the stink of your own festering emotions, feel the lameness in your own soul, search inside the blindness of your own faith, and then go and sit at the far end of the table. The kingdom of God is always an invitation to a banquet. Always. That's where Jesus begins. That's where Jesus ends his ministry. Christ is always our host. Problem is, we may not recognize him. Because after all, isn't he just like the poor and the lame? He ends up, after all, hanging on an old splintered tree, bleeding, dying, defeated. If that's all you see, then he is indeed a foolish guy, and he belongs at the end of the table. What he says has no relationship to our real world of cutthroat business and profit. But Jesus promises that your shift in your table talk will happen when the guests in your life shift. Your internal guests and your external guests. Jesus promises that there will be a resurrection to new life, new table talk, new table fellowship with Christ himself. Your regular guests can't blame you, or can't bless you rather. They can only use you. The poor guests can't bless you either. They can only need you. God can, and God does bless you. But this is not, after all, about us, is it? About you or me. Whether you invite to your life's table new guests of different attitudes and emotions, or new guests of different backgrounds and needs, you will be blessed. That's the promise. Sit down at the other end of the table. Have a different conversation. That's where you find blessing. That's where you find Christ. That's where you become whole. And thanks be to God. Amen.
Amen.